May 7th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war against Nazi Germany was finally over. Across London, Paris, and New York, millions poured into the streets to celebrate the fall of Hitler's empire. Flags waved from windows, church bells rang for the first time in years, and people danced under skies that no longer carried the sound of bombers. But while the world rejoiced, a very different scene was unfolding inside the White House. Behind closed doors and drawn blinds, President Harry S. Truman gathered with his new staff and gave an order that no one in the room could quite believe. "I don't want to hear that name in this building. Not for a while. We clear?" he said suddenly, his tone sharp and final. The staff members exchanged nervous glances. His press secretary, Charlie Ross, shifted in his chair and asked carefully, "Which name, Mr. President?" Truman's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing with fatigue and something close to anger. "You know damn well which name. Roosevelt, Franklin, FDR, any of it. I don't want to hear it unless it's absolutely necessary for official business. Pass the word." The order spread quietly but firmly. From that day forward, the name of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who had led America through 12 turbulent years of depression and war, vanished from conversation inside the White House. It wasn't written down as a rule, but everyone knew. The ban lasted 6 months, from May through October 1945. Staffers learned to talk around the late president's memory as if he had never existed. They called him the previous administration or before. Some simply stopped mid-sentence, letting awkward silences fill the air where Roosevelt's name once stood. New employees were warned in hushed tones. Don't mention Roosevelt around Truman unless you want to see a man's face turn purple. Even casual references were enough to make Truman's temper flare. It was as if Roosevelt's ghost haunted every corridor, and Truman was trying desperately to shut the door on it. But why? Why would the man who had served as Roosevelt's own vice president, who owed his very rise to the presidency to him, refuse even to hear his name? What could make a president so angry that he couldn't bear to acknowledge the legacy he'd inherited? The answer lay not in hatred, but in frustration and in the impossible weight of living in another man's shadow. Harry Truman had been president for less than a month. He had been thrust into power suddenly, without preparation, after Roosevelt's death in April 1945. One moment, he was the quiet, often overlooked vice president. The next, he was leading the most powerful nation on earth in the final, most complex phase of the Second World War. He faced decisions that would shape the entire century, ending the war with Japan, negotiating with Stalin, and understanding the mysterious Manhattan Project that Roosevelt had never even told him about. Every day was a storm of briefings, telegrams, and crises. He was working 18-hour days, sleeping barely 4 hours a night, surviving on coffee, cigarettes, and sheer willpower. And everywhere he turned, he was reminded that he wasn't Roosevelt.
"Mr. President," advisors would say, "when President Roosevelt handled this situation." "Mr. President, the Roosevelt approach was." "Mr. President, FDR always said." It became unbearable. On May 6th, the day before Victory in Europe Day, Truman's patience finally broke. He was in a meeting about post-war economic policy with his cabinet. At the table sat Henry Morgenthau Jr., Roosevelt's longtime Treasury Secretary and one of his most loyal allies. Morgenthau was explaining his post-war plan for Germany, a plan that had already been discussed during Roosevelt's final months. His idea was simple and severe: to dismantle Germany's entire industrial capacity, turn it into an agricultural nation, and make sure it could never again rise as a military power. The plan had a name: the Morgenthau Plan, and Roosevelt had tentatively endorsed it at the Quebec Conference in 1944. As Morgenthau spoke, his voice carried the authority of the man who once sat in the Oval Office. President Roosevelt understood that Germany must be punished severely, he said. President Roosevelt agreed with me that half measures wouldn't work. President Roosevelt wanted. Truman slammed his hand on the table. President Roosevelt, he interrupted, his voice sharp as glass, is dead. The room fell silent. Morgenthau froze, his mouth half open, his face pale. No one dared to speak. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Truman looked around the table, his expression somewhere between exhaustion and fury. "We're not here to worship the past," he said quietly. "We're here to finish the job." That was the moment the tension finally cracked, the breaking point of a man living in the shadow of a legend. Truman continued, his voice tight with controlled fury. "President Roosevelt has been dead for nearly a month. I am the president now, and I think your plan is insane. It would create 50 million starving Germans who would become easy prey for communist agitation. It would destabilize all of Europe. So no, we're not doing it. Meeting adjourned." Truman stood and walked out, leaving Morgenthau sitting there humiliated in front of the entire cabinet. But that confrontation was just the surface. What happened later that evening revealed the real depth of Truman's anger. Charlie Ross, his press secretary and childhood friend, came to the Oval Office around 8 p.m. and found Truman sitting in the dark, a glass of bourbon in his hand. Ross turned on a light. Truman looked exhausted and furious. Ross asked what was wrong. Truman's response was bitter. "Do you know what I found today, Charlie, in Roosevelt's desk? Do you want to know what that son of a left me?" Truman pulled out a folder and threw it across the desk. Ross picked it up and started reading. It was a memorandum Roosevelt had written in February 1945, 2 months before his death, titled Concerns Regarding the Vice President. In it, Roosevelt had documented his doubts about Truman's capability to handle the presidency. He wrote that Truman was a small-minded machine politician from Missouri who lacked the vision and intellect required for global leadership. Roosevelt suggested that perhaps the party should consider replacing Truman on the ticket in 1948 if Roosevelt survived his fourth term.
If Roosevelt didn't survive, the memo suggested that the cabinet should provide extensive guidance and oversight to ensure Truman didn't make catastrophic mistakes. But there was more. Truman told Ross about other discoveries over the past 3 weeks. He had found correspondence between Roosevelt and Stalin, where FDR had made commitments about post-war Eastern Europe that were far more extensive than what was publicly known. Roosevelt had essentially agreed to Soviet domination of Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria in exchange for Stalin's promise to enter the war against Japan. Truman was now stuck with these secret agreements that he had never been consulted about and fundamentally disagreed with. He had discovered that Roosevelt had been excluding him from major decisions, deliberately and systematically. There were notes showing Roosevelt had told advisors not to brief Truman on sensitive matters because he doesn't need to know yet. Roosevelt had kept the vice president away from cabinet meetings, away from diplomatic negotiations, away from military briefings. The Manhattan Project was just the most dramatic example. Truman had been vice president for 82 days and had met alone with Roosevelt exactly twice, for a total of maybe 30 minutes. That wasn't accidental. It was intentional isolation. Truman had also learned something that enraged him on a personal level. Roosevelt had never wanted him as vice president in the first place. The party bosses had forced Truman onto the ticket at the 1944 Democratic Convention because Henry Wallace was considered too left-wing and controversial. Roosevelt had resented this imposition and had taken out his resentment by freezing Truman out completely. Roosevelt had treated his own vice president with contempt, and now Truman was supposed to honor his memory and continue his legacy. Ross asked the obvious question. Why not just tell people the truth about how Roosevelt had treated him? Truman's answer revealed his dilemma. Because I can't. The country needs to believe in Roosevelt right now. The war isn't over. We still have Japan to defeat. The alliance with Britain and the Soviets is fragile. If I started talking Roosevelt's memory, I look petty and small. I look like I'm making excuses for my own inadequacy. The press would destroy me.
So I have to smile and pretend I'm honored to continue his legacy while privately dealing with the mess he left me. The next day, May 7th, VE Day, Truman had to give a national address. He knew millions expected him to praise Roosevelt, to credit him with leading America to victory in Europe. Truman wrote a speech that mentioned Roosevelt exactly once, in a brief acknowledgement that President Roosevelt did not live to see this day, but we know he shares in our victory. That was it. One sentence. His speechwriters had written much more extensive tributes to FDR. Truman cut all of it. The press noticed. Some newspapers criticized Truman for not showing proper respect to his predecessor on this momentous day. That's when Truman gave his staff the informal ban on Roosevelt's name. He couldn't publicly attack Roosevelt without destroying himself politically. But he also couldn't stand hearing constant comparisons and invocations of Roosevelt's memory. So he created a bubble in the White House, where Roosevelt simply wasn't discussed unless absolutely necessary. Staff members learned to navigate this strange prohibition. They developed euphemisms and workarounds. Cabinet memos referred to previous policy instead of Roosevelt's policy. Meetings discussed changing course from prior decisions rather than reversing Roosevelt's approach. The ban created bizarre situations. Eleanor Roosevelt would visit the White House occasionally to collect personal items or discuss UN matters. Staff members would warn each other, "Mrs. Roosevelt is coming today."
Be careful, not because Eleanor was difficult, but because her very presence made it almost impossible to avoid mentioning her husband. Truman was always polite to Eleanor, but their conversations were strained and awkward, both dancing around the elephant in the room. One incident in June 1945 revealed how deeply this went. A young State Department aide was giving Truman a briefing on Soviet demands regarding Poland. The aide said, "Mr. President, at Yalta, President Roosevelt agreed to—" Truman cut him off sharply. "I've read the Yalta agreements. Just tell me what the Soviets are demanding now." The aide, flustered, continued, "Well, sir, they're citing President Roosevelt's commitment to—" Truman stood up. "Are you deaf? I said tell me what they want now, not what Roosevelt promised them." The aide left the meeting shaken. Word spread. Mentioning Roosevelt to Truman was career suicide. But Truman's anger went beyond Roosevelt's specific decisions or the memo calling him incompetent. There was something deeper eating at him. Truman had spent his entire political career being underestimated. He came from a political machine in Kansas City run by Tom Pendergast, which gave him a permanent reputation as a hack and a stooge. He had been elected to the Senate in 1934 and had to fight for respect from colleagues who saw him as Pendergast's errand boy. He had worked hard, chaired important committees, built a reputation for integrity and competence, and still he was dismissed as a lightweight. When Roosevelt picked him as vice president in 1944, Truman thought it was validation. He thought Roosevelt saw something in him, believed in his capabilities. Now he knew the truth. Roosevelt hadn't picked him at all. The party bosses had forced Truman on Roosevelt, and FDR had responded by treating him like an unwanted burden. Everything Truman had achieved meant nothing to Roosevelt. He was just the machine politician from Missouri, not worth briefing, not worth trusting, not worth preparing for the possibility that he might actually become president. The psychological toll this took on Truman was severe. He became paranoid about comparisons to Roosevelt. When newspapers ran stories analyzing how Truman was handling situations differently than FDR would have, Truman would fly into private rages. He told his staff he was sick of being judged against a ghost, sick of being told he wasn't measuring up to a man who had deliberately sabotaged his ability to succeed. The pressure was immense. Truman was making life-and-death decisions about atomic bombs and Soviet expansion, while simultaneously being told by pundits and politicians that he was no Franklin Roosevelt. In July, at the Potsdam Conference, Truman finally had his chance to step out of Roosevelt's shadow. Meeting with Stalin and Churchill and later Clement Attlee when Churchill lost the British election, Truman took a much firmer line with the Soviets than Roosevelt had. When Stalin made demands about reparations from Germany and control of Eastern European governments, Truman pushed back hard. This was noticed immediately. Stalin reportedly told his interpreter, "This is not the same as dealing with Roosevelt. This one has a spine." But even at Potsdam, Roosevelt's ghost haunted Truman. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov kept referencing what Roosevelt had promised at Yalta, insisting that Truman had to honor those commitments. Truman's response was blunt. "I didn't make those promises. I'm not bound by private agreements I was never told about. Roosevelt is dead. You're dealing with me now. And I have different views about how cooperative we're going to be with Soviet expansion." The American press covering Potsdam wrote stories about how Truman was abandoning Roosevelt's vision of post-war cooperation. They portrayed Truman as needlessly antagonistic, as lacking Roosevelt's diplomatic finesse. Truman read these stories and seethed. He was being blamed for not continuing Roosevelt's policy of appeasing Stalin, a policy Truman believed had been naive and had already led to Soviet domination of half of Europe. But he couldn't defend himself without attacking Roosevelt publicly. So he had to absorb the criticism.
August 6, 1945, Truman authorized the atomic bomb to be dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki, Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war was over. Truman had made the most consequential decision of the 20th century, a decision Roosevelt had set in motion but never had to make himself. And immediately, people started asking, would Roosevelt have done it? Would FDR have used the atomic bomb? The speculation drove Truman crazy because Roosevelt hadn't briefed him on the Manhattan Project, hadn't shared his thinking about how the weapon should be used, had left Truman to make an impossible choice with inadequate preparation. In September, 5 months into the informal ban, Truman had a conversation with his wife Bess that revealed how much Roosevelt's treatment still haunted him. Bess mentioned that someone had suggested naming something after Roosevelt, a building or memorial or government program. Truman's response was cold. "Let them. I don't care. But they're not getting me to dedicate it or speak at it. I'm done pretending I have warm feelings about that man." Bess, who rarely challenged Harry, said, "You can't keep nursing this grudge forever. People will notice." Truman shot back, "Let them notice. I spent 82 days as vice president being treated like I was too stupid to be trusted with information. Now I'm supposed to be grateful for the privilege?" The ban started to lift in October 1945, about 6 months after it had begun. What changed? Several things. First, Truman had proven himself. He had made tough decisions about the atomic bomb, about Japan's surrender terms, about Soviet aggression. He had established his own identity as president, separate from Roosevelt's shadow. He didn't need to avoid Roosevelt's name anymore because he wasn't being compared to Roosevelt as much. He was being evaluated on his own terms. Second, Truman had started to separate his anger at Roosevelt from his understanding of Roosevelt's historical importance. He could acknowledge that Roosevelt had led America through Depression and World War, had fundamentally transformed the relationship between government and citizens, had been a genuinely significant president. That didn't mean Truman had to like him or forgive how he had been treated, but it meant Truman could speak Roosevelt's name without rage clouding his judgment. The first time Truman publicly praised Roosevelt after the informal ban was at a Democratic Party event in late October 1945. He gave a speech about the party's achievements and said, "President Roosevelt built the foundation of victory. We are harvesting what he planted." It was hardly effusive praise, but it was more than the bare minimum he had been offering for months. His staff noticed the ban was over. But Truman never forgave Roosevelt. Not really. In private letters and diary entries over the years, Truman remained bitter about how he had been treated. In 1947, he wrote to his sister, "Roosevelt was a great president in many ways, but he was also selfish and short-sighted about succession. He left his country and his vice president completely unprepared for what came after him because he couldn't accept his own mortality." In 1952, leaving office, Truman wrote in his diary, "I accomplished things Roosevelt never could have because I wasn't blinded by my own legend. He thought he was indispensable. I knew I was just a man doing a job." The most revealing moment came in 1960 when Truman gave a series of interviews for a book about his presidency. He was asked directly, "Did you admire President Roosevelt?" Truman paused for a long time, then said, "I admired what he accomplished for the country. I did not admire how he treated people who worked for him. He could be cruel in casual ways, dismissive of people he thought beneath him. I was one of those people. He made that clear. So no, I didn't. I didn't admire him personally, but I respected what he did for America even when I disagreed with how he did it. The interviewer asked if Truman thought Roosevelt had deliberately sabotaged him by not preparing him for the presidency. Truman's response was carefully considered. I think Roosevelt was in denial about dying. He convinced himself he would recover, would serve out his term, maybe even run again in 1948. So he didn't prepare anyone to take over because he wasn't planning to give up power. That's human nature, but it was also irresponsible. A president has a duty to prepare for succession, especially during wartime. Roosevelt failed that duty, and I paid the price. America paid the price for that silence, not in policy, but in understanding. Years after Truman's death, historians began uncovering evidence that cast Roosevelt's treatment of his vice president in a far harsher light. Memos surfaced showing Roosevelt deliberately kept Truman out of key briefings. Internal correspondence revealed that aides were instructed to minimize the vice president's access to sensitive information. There were cabinet records where Roosevelt openly joked about Truman's small-town intellect, and in private letters, Roosevelt confided regret over having to accept Truman as his running mate in 1944, a political compromise forced on him by party pressure, not personal trust.
When these documents came to light, Truman's anger no longer looked petty or thin-skinned. It looked justified. The strange 6-month period in 1945, when the White House avoided saying Roosevelt's name, once dismissed as a quirky rumor, suddenly took on deeper meaning. It wasn't about resentment alone. It was about survival. It was about a man who had been underestimated, humiliated, and thrust into the most powerful position on Earth, trying to carve out a space where he didn't have to pretend admiration for someone who had never respected him. Inside that silence, Truman reclaimed something of himself. He built a presidency defined not by bitterness, but by independence. Over the next 8 years, he made decisions that would shape the modern world, desegregating the U.S. military, confronting Stalin's expansion, launching the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, recognizing the State of Israel and establishing NATO. He wasn't flawless. His dismissal of General Douglas MacArthur nearly destroyed his popularity, but by the time he left office in 1953, no one saw him merely as Roosevelt's successor. He was Harry S. Truman, the man who made the hard choices Roosevelt had postponed. Looking back, that quiet ban on Roosevelt's name seems almost absurd, a trivial act inside the most powerful office in the world. Yet for those who worked there, it was unforgettable. Decades later, former staffers still recalled the tension, the way conversation would pause when someone accidentally said Roosevelt, the way Truman's expression would darken before he moved on. Only after the truth emerged did they understand. Because sometimes even a president, even the man who ordered the atomic bomb, who stared down Stalin, who carried the weight of victory and peace, needs permission to be angry. Truman gave himself that permission the only way he could. For 6 months, he exiled a name, not out of malice, not out of vanity, but because he was human. And sometimes being human means admitting that hearing the name of the person who doubted you, who made you feel small, hurts more than you can say.